Usually when we perform with this overhead projector, we build our performances from scratch. So the first few minutes are silent as we're gluing down microchips and soldering together the circuit in front of the audience so they can see it that way. And then once we've completed the circuit, the performance sort of music begins. And we add more and more of these microchips, and each chip has some software on it that we've programmed to generate sound. And so each chip during the performance is like a different sound generator. And so throughout the performance, we're kind of constantly manipulating these sounds and combining them in different ways to make our thing.
I heard a lot of like kind of noisy or it abrupt, something like all of a sudden it comes. Why was that?
Partly that's just sort of how the sound works, because the nature of the sound is so simple. It's just one bit. It's very jarring and abrupt. Like there's no volume control coming out of the chips, so it's either on or off. But there's also a lot of electronic interference that you sort of hear. So some of the noise is coming by accident.
Okay. So, but it comes more and more noise. How it's not a real composition, isn't it?
It goes back and forth. I mean, tonight we had a kind of form that went from drums to noise to high pitches to drums and sort of drone chips and stuff. So we think about shaping the piece, but it moves back and forth between total chaos, where we have too many wires and too many chips to even keep track of, and then something much simpler that we can understand. So the performances are kind of always this like struggle to figure out how to keep this sound moving in real time, because it's the first time we've heard some of these sounds mixed together, and every performance is going to be slightly different because each chip is a self-contained unit. So anytime you bring in a chip, it starts from zero right there, and we're never going to have like a precisely the same conditions more than once. So they interfere in new ways each time, and there are lots and lots of routes that the sound can take, and the way we mix those together can create very different results, basically.
It is actually kind of a jam, isn't it?
A jam?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Tonight was.
It is a jam, yeah.
Okay.
Very much so.
But then you use this. I'm not an American. What's called this device you're using?
Soldering iron.
Yeah.
The soldering iron. Yeah.
Yeah.
But doesn't that make a sound when you? I mean, while you are doing it, some sound is coming.
It can. Yeah.
Yeah, like at the beginning, especially when it's silent, you notice it. But once there's lots of sound, you don't notice it anymore. Because like when we're building the circuit, it kind of pops every time we touch it. But after that, it just gets overwhelmed by the electronic sound.
Okay, then I think I get it a little more. So, but just for like explaining, the chips is kind of a synthesizer.
They're like very primitive synthesizers. They only have a little tiny bit of memory on them. I think they're 8 kilobytes of memory. So they're like very, very primitive synthesizers, and they only produce one bit sound. They only produce zeros and ones. So they are like primitive synthesizers.
But they're also like digital synthesizers. Like we don't use any analog components. Like a lot of noise circuit musicians build very complex circuits out of analog components to make really beautiful sound. We keep our components to just a minimum. It's just power jack, microchip, and audio output. And all of our sound palette comes from code. So each of these chips is a different computer program, basically. And they have different characters and they respond different ways, so we can perform them in different ways and kind of work around those limitations throughout the performance.
I mean, a synthesizer is generating a waveform or some sort of like oscillator. Is the oscillators, or is it programmed, or?
If we program an oscillator, there's an oscillator, but the sound is being like created from scratch. So if you want to have a 440 hertz tone, you have to output. You have to create a timer and output ones and zeros at 440 hertz. But that's not. You can't take that for granted. You actually have to program all of that. So it's really like when you have a blank palette, what direction do you want to go to create sound?
But how you start with one chip? Are you just like programming every chip?
Yeah, every chip has a program on it, and most of them are also programmed to accept an input, so that we can, even though it has a set program on it, we can change the sound during the course of the performance if we want to.
Wow, how you do that?
we just. They're just simple, they're simple sound synthesizers, so they have some inputs and some outputs, and we've set them up in a way that we can perform them just by touching them with wires and by wiring them together. And so really, we're building an instrument that we can play. And the building of the instrument is also the playing of the instrument. It's kind of like constantly reconfiguring this larger synthesizer that's built out of these little synthesizers, basically.
How do you ever come by a sound you don't like, or like is it like you're keeping changing for getting it on, or like move it in the music, or like it's? I mean, it's. Of course. There must be some you don't like, or what?
Yeah, there's that, and there are also sounds that we really like but are incredibly difficult to listen to because maybe they're very high-pitched or very loud. And those are really fun to perform because once you start one of those and you want to bring in another chip, it might take a minute to solder in a chip because we can't move very quickly. We're stuck. If we put in a chip, we're sort of stuck with that chip for a while. You can't just unplug it or press some buttons to change the sound. So we're always, we get things that we don't like or things that we like, and we just kind of always move with it, I guess.
It's not just like to point out, oh, this must be the chip that just sound bad now, or...
We try not to talk so much.
Yeah, it's usually if one of us can figure it out, we can both figure it out. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to figure out than others. Yeah. But
like the mixer power getting disconnected that I was playing on top of your drum chip.
Yeah.
Or you just add some more.
Yeah, sometimes. Depends. Or we just stop performing.
All right, I just have a couple of more questions. Where are you from, and have you any website?
Yeah, we have loudobjects.com is our official website, and I'm from LA originally, but I lived in New York for about 10 years.
Yeah, and I'm from New York. The three of us right now live in New York, but we're in Denmark doing a residency out in Aarhus.
There are more people, or like
one more person. Kunal can't be here with us, unfortunately. He's in New York right now, but he's flying over in June. We're going to do some performances in Denmark and Sweden and a few other places for a short tour in June.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is there more that you want to add, or?
Thanks, Click Festival, for having us. It was great.
Thanks for letting us have it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Cool.
Ja, det var så godt fløjet. Nu er det tid til TV-avisen.
også. Vi skal jo med dig. Det kan vi også. Ja, det kan vi også. Så hvor er der 5 afsnit? Jeg har arbejdet på det er for dyrt.
Ja.
watch your back, but I did. Good friends don't let you down, they get you wrong. Good friends don't tell no lies, it's all trust. Good friends don't fuck you up, they watch your back, but I did. I know what they will do, I'm like a girl. She knows I know what it is, she's telling me to back the fuck up. I know what they will do, I'm about this world. One thing I know is that I feel my own cup of coffee. But I'm not your parent.